today we're going to talk a little bit about university structure and unit budget models. And, when I first started out as a department head here at Auburn, I'd say that probably dealing with the budget was the most daunting task that I had. And I probably lost the most sleep over it. And I was probably the most anxious and nervous about running out of money and not being able to pay my faculty, or running out of money during summer, or making a mistake and having a big disaster that I would have to deal with. And so I would say this was probably the one thing that scared me the most in going into a leadership role. And it is really, really important to be able to manage the money and be a good steward of the money and make sure that you are kind of putting the money where it makes sense. And so we'll talk a little bit about that as we go through today's talk. And I was going to suggest that if you have any questions, you can just ask them as we go along, but we'll definitely have questions at the end as well, and I had planned on that. So what we're going to do is, Kim, if you'll turn the slide. Okay. So today I'm going to be talking a little bit about mission and what drives your budget, because really and truly, you just shouldn't be spending money. And I did that in the first 5 years as unit leader because I was just scared to death. I didn't really understand the budget. I didn't understand budget models. And that was really before AKA even started. And it had AKA not gotten involved, I'm not so sure that I would have ever learned the information that I really needed to know to be able to understand my budgets. And so we're going to talk a little bit about what drives your budget and how you should set that up. We're going to talk about budget model overviews. So there's different types of budget models, and all of you who are in our Leadership Institute, you're each maybe going to have a little bit of a different situation, and we all know that. Every university is a little bit different in how they run their budget models, but there are a few budget models that are common pretty much for all of us. And so we're all going to be maybe in a little bit of a different situation, but we can still take information from today's talk and kind of apply it, hopefully, to your world. We're going to talk a little bit about types of money. We're going to talk about sources of funding. We're going to talk about final thoughts about some of the things that you might want to think about as you're moving forward and managing money for your unit. And then at the end, I'm going to open it up certainly for you guys if you have any questions, but also I'd like to ask the mentors as we're going through this talk today to think about some thoughts or ideas or strategies that you use while you're working on your budgets or managing your money that might be of use to those who are on the Zoom today in the Leadership Institute. So the next thing that I want to say is I just have one sentence on the slide, and that budget should support your strategic priorities. If you don't have a strategic plan, and I hear people say all the time that strategic plans are a waste of time, or that they're not worthwhile, and that apparently you're doing them wrong, because strategic planning and being strategically organized, as we know from the literature, even from sports psych, that if we set goals and we have short-term goals and priorities, then we seem to meet those goals faster than if we don't have a plan in place. And so it's a little silly, I think, for us in higher education to say that we don't want to be strategically organized or have direction that's really supporting our strategic priorities. There are some budget models that lend themselves more to strategic priorities, like if you're in an RCM, and I'll explain those in just a little bit. I don't think you could manage yourself without having strategic priorities, because the goal is to fund those things that are important to you, that will advance your mission, help you meet your vision, and those hold on to those values that you have. So to me, strategic planning and then budgeting around it is necessary if you're going to really be a good steward of the money and manage your money properly. So Kim, if we could go to that next slide. So There are several different budget models that I'm going to talk about today. This slide really hits on three. There are different types of budget model approaches, but in higher education, as you can see, about 100% of us are falling into one of these three categories. There are modifications or hybrids of these models, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And when this comes from a paper that we published in KR, from a presentation that we gave at the AKA workshop in I think it was 2016. And so some things have changed since then. Like if you look at the percentages, this was from that article. But one of the things that was real obvious around that time in 2016 when we wrote this paper was a number of universities are switching now from historical budget modeling to more responsibility-centered management models. And so I can't remember the exact number, but I want to believe that at least 1/4 of the institutions that were in a historical budgeting approach was either shifting or planning to shift to a responsibility-centered model before too long. And then there's also zero-based budgeting. So all of these, none of these are bad or good. They're all just what they are. They're a way to manage money within a university system. If they're managed properly, or if your institution implements these models the way they were designed, then they should work for you. But you want to learn how to kind of play the game of whatever model that you have and learn how to really strategize to be able to accomplish the goals that you want to be able to accomplish for your unit. So looking at historical, and I have a slide for each one of these, but basically historical budget, and I've had experience in all three of these. Historical budgeting is kind of set up so things don't change very much. You get the same few pennies every year that they give you every year. There's very little change to what happens. You have to figure out ways to generate more revenue to support your budget, because in general you're not going to be getting a whole lot more money based on what you're doing from the university. The key questions, and I think things to really think about when you're in a budget, when one of your whatever budget model you're in, is who is the person in control of the money and who are the decision makers on where the money goes. And so for a historical budget model, usually the provost is holding the purse strings, and you kind of have to go hat in hand to the provost because they have all the money. And you usually go through your dean. Sometimes the dean might be in control of it, but with historical budgeting, it's usually at the higher end. So we're going to talk about each of this and then who's kind of managing the money. For responsibility-centered management, that's decentralized. It's very, very different than historical budgeting, where all the money is held at the top and you kind of have to go and beg, and you go and tell them what your plans are, and can I get another faculty line? Can I start a new program? Can I do renovations in my building? All of that kind of lies at someone else's discretion, typically at the provost level. Responsibility-centered management, it shifts, and so the money is decentralized, and so the money goes to whoever is generating the money. It's kind of and you have to pay for service. Now, there are very few full RCMs. I've only heard of a few, but when we get to that slide, we'll talk a little bit more about it. In this case, the money kind of comes down from the top, and it's usually housed at they call it the unit level. At most universities, the unit level is the dean. It doesn't always trickle all the way down to the chair or head position. It's the dean who is then kind of helping to make decisions on how the money is going to be spent and how it's going to be distributed. If it's managed properly, then the units that are generating the most money should be getting the most money. Even though it says that all the money that's generated goes to the unit, there's a lot more to that story than just. It doesn't happen that way. And so we'll talk a little bit about that when we get to that slide. And then for zero-based budgeting, that's centralized again. So it goes back up to the top. It's generally run by the provost or a dean in some cases. This requires huge advocacy on the part of the unit leader, because every year your budget is cleared, and every year you have to go with a proposal and explain why you want the money that you want. Historical is not nearly as complicated as that. So you're going to have to write every year your budget and explain why, justify why you need the money that you're asking for. So let's go into each of these just a little bit more. So Kim, if you'll advance the slide, we're going to talk just a little bit then about this historical budgeting or incremental budgeting. There's some pros and cons to it. So the definition is traditional budget model in which the budget proposals and allocations are based on the funding levels of the previous year. Only new revenue is really allocated, and so you're really just going to get enough money to maintenance money to run your shop. In some cases, they maybe don't even give you enough money to run your shop for maintenance, and then they're going to give you the money for your salaries and things like that. And so if there is some kind of disaster like COVID just happened, or there's some kind of fallout budget-wise, the way that generally works for a historical budget model is everybody across the board is going to lose a certain percentage. And so they will come to you and say, we've had a fallout, we don't have enough money to make ends meet, we're going to scrape 2 or 3% or 4 or 5% off of everybody's budget, and you're going to just have a lot less money to work with next year, but you're going to have to figure that out yourselves. And that's kind of the way historical budgeting works. It doesn't say, hey, you programs in kinesiology, I'll have 1 million students, and because y'all generate so much revenue, we're not going to take quite so much away from you. That's not the way it works. It's across the board in almost all cases. The benefits to it is pretty simple. None of us were really raised accountants. We didn't study accounting or finance or budgeting. And so, higher education is being run by a bunch of people who were created to be faculty members, and now they're administrators. And in many cases, they really don't understand budgeting and how budgeting works. And so this is a really great approach for people who are not really well trained on how to manage money. And so what happens is that you just kind of, you just are dealing with kind of a simple approach. That's the benefit. It's also very predictable then for higher administration. They know that they're going to give you, every year I got $57,000 or $58,000 to run my shop. And so they knew kinesiology will get $58,000 in operations, and then we know how much their salaries are. So it was very predictable for higher education, or for the institution, to know where they were headed and where they were going. And so it was kind of a safe zone. The drawback on it is that it's difficult to determine where the costs have been incurred, because you don't really have to code very much. I never coded whether it was research spending or instructional spending or outreach or service. We didn't code any of that. And so it's really track down and drill into what programs are costing you money, and are they worth it, and is the program meeting the mission, and is the cost of it worth you keep investing in it? And I will say that in higher ed, we kind of get entrenched in how things are being done, and we think that it should always be that way. You shouldn't think like that with budgeting at all. You need to think about, does this still make sense 10 years later that I'm funding a program, or I'm funding this initiative, and it may not even be meeting the university strategic goals and initiatives anymore. So things come and go, right? Just like in any businesses on business make it, some don't. You've got to keep working on trying to keep yourself alive. I would say that's true for all budget models, that you will have to be creative and thinking about ways to generate revenue. The other kind of drawback for me for historical budgeting is that, and for us in kinesiology, in many cases, we might have 1,000, 1,200 students, and we're looking at our other programs in our colleges and wondering, we're footing a lot of the bill for a lot of things. The problem with historical is you can teach one student or teach 10 billion students, and you're still going to get the same dime from the university, right? And so that doesn't feel quite right, and it kind of generates a feeling of mediocrity. Why would I kill myself? Because nothing's going to change. Why would I do more? And so I see historical budgeting as not a very good motivator. and especially for our kinds of programs, since in many cases we do have large enrolled programs, high enrolled programs. All right, Kim, if you'll switch to the next slide. So talked a little bit about historical budgeting. Let's talk a little bit about responsibility-centered management. This model is, we call them RCMs. There are very few people that have what I would call a full RCM, because it would be pretty complicated. I only know of one institution that kind of took that on, and that was Clemson, and it's pretty complicated for the way they ran it. And so a lot of us have learned not to maybe follow a full RCM, but maybe a hybrid. So what an RCM is closer to management philosophy than really a budgeting strategy, but it's designed to support the achievement of academic priorities within the institution. Hence the reason why you really got to have a strategic plan in place, because you're really looking to, what do I want to really fund? What is it that is important to us to advance the mission of our program's mission, but the university and our college and so forth. When RCMs delegate operational authority to the school divisions and other units within the institution, allowing them to prioritize their academic missions. And so that gets really exciting. You can make money in an RCM, and also everything is kind of, what you do. Research has what we call widget rates, and we get money for how much maybe research grant money we bring in. But the biggest revenue generator in an RCM is teaching, which kind of changes the shifts a little bit the values of the program. And I think for years we kind of got away from teaching because it wasn't the thing that made the most money. But in my program, my biggest money makers are my clinical faculty, because they teach more students than everybody else. And so it does help you to kind of think and value people in different ways as well. It can really create a lot of competition, and that's a bit of a drawback, because it's you kind of fight for students, right? So it might be that I think, if I create this course, I could probably pull a lot of students away from this program, and they could come into our program and take these courses. You kind of get a little competitive about students and getting students into your program. But that all can be managed if you kind of create a hybrid, which most of us are in. It's really motivating, because you can see that, gosh, if we teach a whole bunch of students, we can make a lot more money. If we do this, if we do entrepreneurial efforts, we get to bring that money back into our program and invest it in the ways we'd like, rather than it getting scraped up top and going to somebody else. And again, I mentioned this before, but the model is only as good as it can be implemented by the people who are in your program. So I'll give an example. I heard from someone not too long ago that they'd like for me to come and talk to their program about an RCM to kind of get ready. They were getting ready to shift over to an RCM, and there's some real strategy involved in making sure you're a player in going through all of that. And so my point was, when they told me what their dean was doing, was that, well, that's not really an RCM. All the money's going to the unit. The unit is the dean's level, but the dean is treating everybody like a historical-based budget model, where they're just getting the same money they used to get years ago in a historical, and the dean was keeping all the money and then trying to figure out where that person wanted to put the money. That kind of breaks down the whole motivation and incentive. The RCM is supposed to be real incentivizing. It's supposed to motivate you. If you don't see the outcomes of the RCM, your hard work, it will fail. So if you're looking for jobs, in higher ed, and you're looking for leadership jobs, you do want to find out what kind of model the university's running. And you also want to find out if your boss is running the model the way it should be, because you could end up really struggling through a budget, the experience of trying to make the budget run right. So I kind of emphasize that because it's kind of important. Kim, can you switch to the next slide? The third option is zero-based budget modeling, and that is at the beginning of every budget planning period, the previous year's budget for each unit is cleared. They sweep your reserve, and every part of the institution must re-request funding levels, and all spending must be rejustified. My very first job in higher ed, we were under a zero-based budgeting. The department head would come to us every year and say, you need to explain to me, if you need this money, we're going to have to justify it. And so it was a lot of involvement in zero-based budgeting to every year to kind of, be able to prepare and plan ahead for what was in front of you. The benefits of a zero-based budget model is it's an effective way of controlling unnecessary cost. Since departments and divisions do not automatically receive a certain sum each year, all money allocated to the unit really has to have a purpose. It avoids waste, and it really keeps discretionary spending to a minimum, but then it doesn't allow you to really go out and invest and try to grow a program or grow something because you're really bound to, it's a tough go. There is an entitlement mentality in higher ed. I kind of mentioned that a little bit earlier. It kind of zaps that because every year you're not entitled to anything. You have to justify everything you do. And but there's some people who say it's just a bit too much controlling and a bit much than maybe we really need in higher education to really be able to manage and to really allow us to create revenue. It might be pretty limiting. Now, when I'm here at Auburn, occasionally we would do a zero-based budget model year. Like we were a historical based budget model, but about every 5 or 6 years, the university would do a zero, sweep all of our reserves, and then make us start over. And the primary reason for that, for universities doing that, is that unit leaders get nervous, I think, about money, and they want to have some money in reserve. And so you hoard away a little bit of money to make sure that, if something goes wrong, you've got money. Well, the problem with that is hoarding away money means that you've got money sitting in the bank, and we're not a savings account. And so it really sends a bad message to upper administration if you have money left over each year, because it's like, well, you asked for money and you didn't even spend it, so you obviously don't need that much money. And then you go, well, wait a minute, we have all these things we want to do. Well, then do those things with the reserves that you have. Don't pack money away, because it is a really bad message, and it won't take long before they stop giving you money, because they'll say you have money in reserve. And that certainly has happened at Auburn on a number of occasions. It's still happening in our college to a certain degree, that there are units that have large sums of money that they're not spending. And in some cases, I think because when I started out as a unit leader, I didn't even understand how much money I really had. And so I was scared to say yes to anything. I just say, no, we don't have enough money. I don't think we have enough money to do that. But I really didn't understand my model, and I didn't understand kind of how the money was flowing and where things are coming from and how to ask for money. So I think those are things to really avoid if you're working with money for your unit. You're going to have to really learn fast. What's the model? How do I manage so that I can get more money for my unit and advance the priorities and the strategic initiatives that we really want to accomplish? And so that's our job as leaders. But again, don't save too much money. Now, some people will say, well, how much is enough money for reserve? And I think every university has their own rules. Even within Auburn, I hear different numbers. Some people say 4%, some people say 6%, some people say you ought to have 10%. The bottom line is that you want to have a little bit of reserve, but you want it to make sense. And then if there is a time where, you are, I want to say for something really big, then you justify that. You say, the reason why I have this reserve is because I'm getting ready to renovate a whole bunch of space, or I need to start a new program, or we need to hire a faculty member. So I'm trying to, or an adjunct or something to try to, explain why it is that you have reserved money. All right, so Kim, if you'll go to the next slide. So for budget models, like I mentioned, they're often mixed models. So like with an RCM, oftentimes to prevent just overt competition, they'll shift it a little bit, and they'll say, we're going to skim some off the top. They don't like to call it a tax. I call it a tax, and it irks some people, but that's exactly what it is. They take money from all units a little bit, and that goes to, we call it I can't remember, it's Mission Enhancement Fund, to kind of support upper administration, because the upper administration is, they're not revenue generators, right? And now in an RCM, I have a fund. Actually, we're always the revenue generators. We just, in a historical, we don't. But in RCM, you see real quickly, everybody's paying for us to have a president and a provost, and library and facilities and all these other things that kind of come our way, or things that we need to use, libraries and stuff like that. So with the RCM, generally what they'll do then is they'll tax you to pay for these things, so that you don't have to write a paycheck or a check to every entity that you use on campus. Like, you just screwed a light bulb in my lab, so I'm going to have to pay you to do that. They take a percentage off the top to pay for certain things, and that's kind of a mixed model. And I'd say most of RCMs are in mixed models. It also pays for low interest but valued programs. I think a good example of that at Auburn is we have an aviation program. It's not a huge program, but it's something that Auburn values and that they want to have on their campus. And so it's an expensive program, so we're all going to chip in a little bit to keep that aviation program running. And so that's a mixed model for RCM. For zero-based budgeting, there may also, like I mentioned earlier, a time where historical, and if you're a historical, that you're using a zero-based to clear out and start over. But there's combinations. Also, allocation systems are unique within each institution. So there are rules for each budget model. And to kind of give you an example, I am in an RCM. It's not like you need to remember these percentages, but I think it just gives you an idea. In our RCM, if my faculty teach one of our majors, we get 100% of the teaching, the instructional cost that comes in for that. Now, mind you, we're going to skim some off the top for a mission enhancement fund. The dean gets to manage the money at the unit level, so it's not necessarily true that I'm going to get 100% of everything, but it should come back to unit level 100% of teaching. Now, if somebody else at the university teaches one of my students a class, they're going to get 70%. And if I teach somebody, so the percentages then change and break down based on that. Every university is going to have different rules and regulations for these kinds of things, right? And so you need to know what your budget model calls for. You need to decide, do I want to create an elective course that other students on campus would take, and I could get a GTA to teach it? And how much could I make doing that? And then I'm providing students with a really great course. I'm serving students, but how can I create it so that I'm making money? Or am I not making money, and does it not make any sense to do this at all? And so that's kind of the way to think a little bit about the rules for each unit. You need to know the rules for your university if you're really going to be able to take advantage of whatever model you're in. And then that's really important to know who makes the decisions. So in my case, I have a provost who's in a little bit of a violation in my mind with how an RCM runs, because I still have to go to my provost to ask him to do just about anything, go through my dean to my provost. And that's not really the way RCMs are supposed to work. If I have the money to do it, and I can tell my dean, you know what, I have enough money to set aside that I really kind of want to do this, then he should really be able to say to me, yeah, Mary, I think you've got the money, and looking at the budgets, I think this makes sense, and you're projecting out that we'll make $2 million in this in the next 3 years, so why don't we jump on board and do this? I have a provost who can say no, even if I have the money, which is a little incentivizing for me, because I have the money. Why would he say no? Now, I mean, if he comes back with some really great reasons, that's okay. But in an RCM, that's not really the way it's supposed to work. I should have to go to my dean, and he's the one who really should be helping make decisions on how we move forward. If you're in a historical, the odds are you're going to have to go hat in hand to your provost, and I'm doing that now in an RCM, but go to him. But then you've got to be really smart about how you pull that off. So Kim, if you could go to the next slide, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. I'm going to talk more about that in a couple slides when we talk about strategies. But I also wanted to mention that there are different types of money. And in the beginning, I don't know if I understood all this very well, but you've got discretionary money, which is flexible. You might not have a whole lot of flexible money, especially if you're in historical based budget modeling, unless you are creative in making money. But you have discretionary and non-discretionary spending. And so things like your faculty salaries, that's not flexible. You got to pay them. They're going to be working for the whole year, so you got to have the money in place. You can't spend that money on something else, and you have to kind of keep that money in place. But you also have flexible money, and that's the money that you might have if you generate through different sources, and we'll talk about that in just a second. Really creating money for things like travel, luxury purchases. I put down AKA sponsorship because our school sees that as one of the most important things that we do. And some people say, well, wait a minute, you're not leaving that in-house. You're spending money at AKA. This experience to me and having a connection with other people who are experiencing similar problems is invaluable to our unit. I would say that the vast majority of all the things that we have done to take our unit from a kind of dirt poor unit to a pretty wealthy unit has been the ideas that came from AKA. So I see that as an invaluable investment for us as a school. So we sponsor AKA. Well, you can't do that if you don't have any discretionary money at all. But if you do start generating discretionary money, you want to invest it in things like that. So things like paying for renovations, or a faculty member comes to you with a really great idea and you'd like to help them in some way. That's all discretionary spending. There's also terms like unrestricted and restricted funding. And so if you have donors who are giving money, and I will say all of us, I don't care whether you're doctoral, master's, or bachelor institution, everybody can bring in donor money. In fact, I used to go to AKA just to pick the brain of the Slippery Rock department head, because he was a sports management guy and he seemed to be doing some really cool stuff that was bringing great visibility and generating revenue. And so that, they weren't a doctoral program. Not doctoral programs, we have some privileges for money like research, but there's millions of ways to make money. It doesn't just involve research. And then the majority of your budget is fixed. I did want to say, so you do have, if you have a donor and they tell you, I want you to spend this money on a scholarship for a kid from Madison County, and I want them to be going into adapted physical education, well, that's what you're going to do. You're going to spend that money just on that. But there are some unrestricted funds that come in when you have a donor. Wonderful days when those donors come in and say, hey, I'd just like to give you some money and you put it wherever you think is best to help advance your mission. Well, then it's unrestricted. You have to be careful. You can't spend restricted money on things that are not listed within the guidelines of how the money came in. So the majority of everybody, whether you're in an RCM, whether you're in a historical or whatever budget model you're in, your budget is pretty fixed. You don't have a whole lot of wiggle room. The vast majority of all money of our budgets is our salaries, and you have to be aggressive in changing that and pursuing ways to reduce revenue. So Kim, if you'll go to the next slide. So some sources of funding to think about, and I put a little asterisk by 2 because, I always hear people say, Mary, you're at Auburn and Auburn has lots of money. And because you have lots of money, it's different for everybody else. And so the examples you give might not relate. We were not where we are today. 15 years ago, we did not have hardly any money. We were on a historical-based budget model, and we were pretty poor in a not so great facility. And I think we were in the situation that a whole lot of schools are in. But we all worked really, really hard to try to find ways to generate revenue. And a funny story, when I took the job as interim department head 17 years ago, 15, 16 years, 7 years ago, the one thing I said in the interview was, I don't like dealing with money. I'm not a fundraiser. I like helping promote faculty. I can be a cheerleader. I can do a lot of things. I can really work on curriculum. We can bring about some positive change, but I'm not a fundraiser. That was probably one of the dumbest things I've ever said, because the ultimate deal is that we're all going. That's our job, and we have to find money to really promote the work, to promote our mission. So looking at this, then you got state dollars. If you're a state-supported school, you might not have that. If you are a state-supported school or at a state-supported school, oftentimes the money that comes in for teaching is based on zip code. Not all states do this. California doesn't do it. Texas has got a little bit of their own way of doing things. And some of the states, abide by this or not, but the National Center for Educational Statistics has pretty much assigned every academic discipline a number. Kinesiology has multiple numbers that we fall into. If you're in education program, then your zip code is probably a 13 something, 13 point, blah, 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 blah. If you're an athletic training program, your zip code might be a 51. If you've deemed yourself more of a science, and that's what one of the things we did at Auburn was we took on a 26 ZIP, which is biological sciences, which includes exercise science and a few things that we do. But 26 ZIPs make you eligible for STEM. Well, STEM funding from federal government. Well, some of you might not be interested in that at all. Doesn't matter. You want the code to be the right number for whatever it is that represents you, but you want to know what your zip code is. You want to at least be knowledgeable about that. And it could be then, so what happens then at the state level is the state then allocates money based on your zip code. You get a certain amount of money for that, for the number of students that were enrolled in that zip. And so you could be shortchanging yourself if you're in the wrong zip code, or you might think about it in a little bit different way, and it might not have any impact on you whatsoever. But some states do provide funding to the university based on the number of students enrolled in each of those zip codes. Tuition. And any of these at the end, if you have questions, we can talk about it. Tuition, in an RCM, we get to see our tuition money coming in, and so it's pretty inspiring. But the bottom line is that the university is making money off tuition, bottom line, right? It's one of the biggest revenue generators we got going. And if you're on a historical-based budget model, you don't really see that, but you know that, right? And so it might give you some power or leverage to go back to your dean if you're in a historical-based budget model, or go through your dean to your provost and saying, boy, are we underfunded and it's not right, and we're feeling a little like this is totally unfair that we're generating all this revenue to support all these other programs, which we're fine with helping to share, but we feel like we aren't getting quite enough fair share of our part that we're generating. So you can duke around with that, but you have to be aware of it, right? And you have to know. We have 1,500 students in our program. We're creating a lot of money. Through an RCM, I've been able to drill down to know exactly what my PETE program cost me, and whether it's viable or not, and whether it makes sense, and what we're going to have to do to either address that problem. It's really nice to be an RCM because you can kind of see where the money's flowing and how much things cost you, but you still kind of know, right? If you know that if you're in a college, I didn't know for years what the number was, but we generate about 60% of our college's budget. Well, there's 4 programs, 4 academic units in our college, and we're generating more than half the money. So that's a fun conversation when I meet with people and say, well, that's nice, but we're generating more than half the money. Maybe we ought to be getting a little bit more than maybe a 1/4. And so you've got to build your defenses. And I see this, I know some people laugh. I see this as a game. I find it to be quite fun to see what all we can accomplish through maneuvering with the budget. Gift monies. Everybody can bring in gift money. Research. Not everybody has that privilege. Probably on this call, some of the programs, you maybe don't have as high-end research program. You're not a R1 institution, but that's okay. But if you are in a place where there is research opportunities to bring in external money, there's direct and there's indirect cost returns. So the direct return is like the faculty member writes and says, I'm going to do this, 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 and it's going to cost $1.4 million to pull that off. Well, there's also indirect costs, and those indirect costs are things like, well, they are going to be using the buildings of the university, and they're going to be using maybe a lab, and they're going to be using the computers that are in those labs, and they're going to be using in some cases, maybe the personnel. So there's indirect return. That means money that comes back to the unit because of depreciation on the things that we have already provided this faculty, equipment or whatever it might be. So there's an opportunity to make some money, obviously money to go to the project, that's direct, but also to generate some revenue for your unit to kind of help maybe replace equipment or for what you want to spend it based on whatever your priorities are. And then there's entrepreneurial efforts. That's an opportunity for everybody. It doesn't matter what program you're coming from. And there's lots and lots and lots of entrepreneurial efforts, and we all have opportunity to go there and do that. So Kim, if you'll move me to my next slide. So things to think about then after some of the things that I've talked about. Important considerations. Do remember that each budget type has different rules and uses, and you got to kind of figure out what those are. Understand the rules driving the spending decisions, like if your university is really pushing something and it's an initiative that you could jump on and it will generate revenue for you, it's a priority for the university, so they're going to love you for doing it. We have a tendency we do that a lot in our school here at Auburn. If the university promotes something like, I don't know, about 10 years ago, they decided that we didn't have enough classroom space for all the students that they wanted to bring to campus. So they really encouraged us to create online educational experiences for undergraduate students. And we jumped on that. We didn't jump on it for those basic, standard courses like biomechanics, next phys, and motor learning. We now have done that through the COVID experience, but we created a lot of fun elective courses for students that were really meaningful courses, but courses that the students on campus would want to take. The university incentivized that, and we made $1 jillion doing that. So we created courses like weight control. We jumped on a med term course that we have about 2,000 students a year that takes that course. It's an elective. We created an online course for physical activity course called Active Auburn that we ultimately now sell at a national level. Here, a little commercial. But that online course has generated, we probably have 3,000 students a year taking an online course. We don't have to have a space for them. And that was generating an enormous amount of money for us. But that was what our university incentivized, right? So if you pay attention and the university's begging for you to do something because they have a need or need to meet a strategic initiative goal, then if you can do it, you should jump on it. One, they kind of like you for it, but two, they will, you make a lot of money. When you start making a lot of money, things change. It's a lot more fun to have money than not to have money. So some other things to think about, even if you're in a historical-based budget model, and it would be wise to go ahead and code purchases and code what your spending expenditures are so that you kind of know where you're spending your money. That was something that I didn't do in the beginning, but now realize that it's pretty important to do to kind of know where the money's going and how you're spending it. I mentioned this before, but again, want to re-emphasize that there are issues with reserves, and when you start tucking away money, it will be a problem for everyone in your college. So we do want to make sure that you don't think about money as saving, because I worried a lot. I was, oh man, I just want to have a little bit of money in case something goes wrong. As a reminder to all of you, there are safety nets built into universities because none of us have really ever been trained in what we're doing. And so there's safety nets, there's at your unit level, you have a financial person in many cases, but definitely at the college level, somebody's kind of watching over you to kind of make sure you're not going too far out there. And then you also have the university level. So there's checks and balances. There are times when you can have a disaster. And you could have a big hit, but there are things in place to kind of save you. I used to make this joke to my former dean. I would say, well, I'm just going to go ahead and try it. If we get in trouble, lose a lot of money, somebody will bail us out, right? And she would always say, yeah, we'll bail you out, but you probably won't have a job for very long. But that might be not a bad idea if you can't manage the money. But there is something to be said, about, there are other people watching what you're doing. And then you also want to think about when you're going for ask, like asking, is this a one-time ask or is this going to be a continuous ask? Like if you're asking for a faculty line, well, that's continuous money for as long as that line is in place, if it's a tenure track position. So you might say, I'm not so sure right now in the financial situation our university's in that it even makes sense that I ask for a tenure track. Perhaps maybe I'll just say we need a tenure track, but I'm willing to go right now with a clinical faculty member that's reappointed each year until we can maybe get to the place where we can hire a tenure track, or can I at least hire some adjuncts to kind of pull this off until we have a better view of what's coming down the road in terms of our budget. So one-time money is a much more administrators love that approach a little bit more than always continuous money requests. And then relationship with your accountant or whoever your executive assistant is or whoever that might be, you need to have a really great working relationship with that person. And they need to understand your mission to guide your decisions. I work very closely with the financial person who works in our unit. We have a financial person. But I will say that before I hired this person, I had a person in this position that couldn't multiply and divide. All right. And so it was a real challenge for me because another thing that I will say is that, some unit leaders get really hung up in budget. I don't spend hardly any time in my budgets. In fact, I don't even have access to my budget pages. I don't want to, that's not what my level, I don't see myself there. I'm asking someone else to show me how much money I have. I'm asking someone else to help me in looking at my budgets. I could see myself as a big picture. I look and say, we're kind of in the right place for where we need to be for, January. We're about halfway through the school year. I'm looking at it kind of generally. I am not sweating over pennies at all. And so if you've got somebody you can trust and somebody you can work with, what that does is free you up to kind of do your job in finding revenue and opportunities for revenue. It's important for the leader to understand the budget approach. So I did not understand anything about this when I first started as a unit leader. I feel like it took me about 4 or 5 years to figure out what was going on. I should have required that my university train me on budgeting. I should have insisted that I get training, or I find a way. I started going to a guy who's now an associate provost, but I would go to him on occasion because he was in the finance department and I knew him, and I'd say, does this kind of make sense? So I at least started seeking advice on how to really be smart with managing the money. So Kim, if you'll shoot me to that next slide. So final thoughts then, and just some ideas, things to think about, and then I'll kind of open it up for us to kind of talk and chat about any questions you might have. So you need to know your model and you need to know the source of funds. You need to know who's in control. Um, you can cast requests to their priorities and style. Um, I have a provost who is a businessman. Okay. Uh, he's all about numbers and money. In fact, that's all he cares about. In fact, he's never even taught a class. So I got a provost who's a numbers monies guy. So I'm never going to go with a proposal that says this would just be good for all of us, or we think this would be a good idea. I'm projecting out how much money I'm going to make from these initiatives. He's insisting, or I'm not going to get any approval for anything, right? That can irk me, and sometimes it does, but that is not how I can play the game. Me being irked isn't helping my faculty meet their mission and their objectives, right? But my goal is to figure out how I can convince a provost that this is the greatest thing since sliced bread. And so I'm going to have to take his style into consideration as I put together my proposal. I am never going to put together a proposal that would go anywhere unless I tag it onto strategic initiatives, because anybody in the right mind is going to expect it to advance mission. Any decent leader is going to expect you to do that. And so you should say, how's this going to advance the university mission? How's this going to advance college mission so it makes the dean happy? And how's this going to make, how's it going to advance the work that we do at the unit level? And so that's one key thing to remember is you want to play the game right, and batting your head up against the wall and getting angry doesn't seem to solve any of those problems at all. Now, interestingly enough, I don't know, I can't see who's on here, and I don't know if Dean Fairbrother is here, but we hired a new dean, and that's Dean Fairbrother and Jeff Fairbrother, and we're really lucky now that we have a dean who's in kinesiology and kind of understands our plight. But I also found out when he got here, after reviewing his CV, that he has a degree in English. So he also expects sentences and proper. he wants it to flow and tell a nice story, and so I also have to write to make sure that my dean appreciates it. And those are okay things to have to do. But sometimes we get real frustrated with that, and then we spend all our energy and time being frustrated with the process. Whatever the process is the process. You accepted to be a leader, then lead with what you've got and try to make the best of it all. But I've actually turned the money now, fundraising and trying to figure out ways to generate revenue is the most fun thing I've ever done. I actually find it to be the most interesting part of my job. So you also need to learn to play the game. So work with administrative staff to understand the rules. So your unit, I talked to the person who's my financial person and saying how, the faculty this year said they really want me to put all the money into graduate assistantships. They want me to, we pay to replace equipment. A lot of institutions don't do that. But that's what my faculty told me, how they wanted me to spend the money. We don't do other things, but we do that. They also told me they wanted to go to conferences and not pay for anything. And so we pay for everybody to go to any conference that they want to. That could be a mind blow for some of you and go, wow, well, that's ridiculous. But you know what? It's not ridiculous. You can do it if you just got to set your priorities, and you got to go start really trying to figure out ways to be smart in generating revenue by serving your students, your faculty, and your program. So I would strongly recommend that you front load your budget. I didn't do that for about the first 5 or 6 years, and I was lost. I had no idea. I didn't sleep at night. I was worried sick we were going to run out of money. I finally mentioned to the provost office that I would like some training on how to manage the money and budget, because I wasn't budgeting. All I was doing was spending money and hoping at the end of the year I still had money left over. And I would see that as a huge success if we got to the end, but it wasn't like we were really advancing our mission. We were through the year. And so front loading the budget was something that was taught to me by just getting a spreadsheet and looking at last year's budget and coming up with what you think your expenses are going to be, try to guess it the best you can, and then pull out monthly how much money you were spending to see how much money you had left. That gave me peace of mind. That was probably one of the smartest things that ever happened, or the best things that ever happened to me in terms of just feeling comfortable about managing money. And then longer term focus. So when I mentioned earlier, I don't get in my budgets. I'm not checking every number to see if it's right. Oh, did they give me exactly what they promised me they would? Well, I got a financial person that can do that, and I got a person at college that can do that. What I should be doing is not sitting and looking at those numbers. To me, my job is to go out and try to find longer term ways to make money, that grow money, that's flexible for my people so that I can apply it to the strategic initiatives that we have. So that's that's kind of to me that's pretty important, um, because like in the last few years, in fact, I just told someone today in a faculty review meeting, yeah, I'm going to start stepping down at the end of this year, from doing a lot of national things like Leadership Institute and the being a president for NASPA and doing some of those things. And I'm going to come back and spend a lot of time before I retire really trying to create money opportunities for the school through entrepreneurial efforts, because there are so many opportunities out there. So with that being said, I'm starting to focus my attention on things that really can bring in patents. Even you say, well, that's just for R1s. No, it's not. Patents are for anybody. And there's lots of ways to generate revenue and money, and lots of entrepreneurial efforts. We have lots of, our students and our faculty have a lot of great ideas on how to do that. And then the last thing I'm going to say before I turn it over to you guys is, when you're dealing with money, and you're trying to generate money, um, anytime you invest money back into a priority, it's a risk. Um, I've invested money where, we didn't make a dime and it wasn't a great investment. And we said, okay, we won't do that anymore. It didn't pan out. But on the other hand, there's been some things that we've jumped on that have really paid off. But you're going to have to take a risk every once in a while, or you're always just going to be sitting with the same pot of money. So I think I'll stop there and kind of open up for questions, and we'll kind of go from there. And then also like to ask the mentors, if there's anything you want to share, let's hit with some questions. And then if you have anything you'd like to share, with how strategies that you've used to kind of help you manage your budgets, or being a good steward of the money, we would love to hear from you guys as well. So what questions do we have?